Thomas Grady had lived on his ranch for many years, and he had grown used to quiet mornings. He usually started his day by feeding the horses, checking the fences, and making sure the cattle were grazing peacefully. That morning looked no different at first. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the sky with soft pink and golden colors. A cool breeze moved across the tall grass, and the world felt calm and still. Thomas took a slow breath and smiled. It felt like the beginning of a peaceful day, until he heard something unexpected. At first, it sounded like a distant echo, so faint that he thought he had imagined it. Then it came again, clearer this time. A voice. A woman's voice. It carried across the open land and cut through the morning quietness. Thomas froze and turned his head toward the direction of the river. Living so far from town, he rarely heard anyone calling out. The voice came again, louder, and filled with worry. "Rancher, please. They stole my things." This time the cry was unmistakable. Thomas felt his heart jump. He wiped his hands on his jeans, quickly dropped the bucket he was carrying, and hurried toward the river. His boots kicked up dust as he moved faster than he had in years. It wasn't often that someone needed help, not out here. Not in such an urgent way, and he wasn't going to ignore it. The river wasn't far, but the path to it was uneven, winding between rocks, brush, and uneven patches of ground. As Thomas got closer, he could hear splashing water and the woman's voice again. The worry in her tone pushed him forward even faster. When he finally reached the riverbank, he saw something he never expected. A woman stood waist-deep in the cool, moving water. The light breeze blew her long dark hair across her face, and she looked both frightened and frustrated. She wore simple clothing that clung to her because of the water, making her look even more uncomfortable. She was pointing toward the hills on the other side of the river, where a small cloud of dust showed that someone or several people had just ridden away. Thomas lifted a hand to shade his eyes from the rising sun. He followed her gaze to the dust trail disappearing in the distance. Whoever she was talking about had already gotten far. Still, Thomas knew he had to speak to her first. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he called out, stepping closer to the river. The woman turned her head quickly when she heard his voice. She looked relieved to finally see someone. She pushed a strand of wet hair from her face and took a shaky breath. "Please," she said again, her voice softer but still full of emotion. "They stole my things." Thomas nodded gently, trying to show that he understood her distress. He held out his hand, motioning for her to come toward the bank. "It's okay. Come out of the water. You'll be cold," he said in a calm, steady voice. The woman hesitated at first, as if she wasn't sure whether she could trust him. But after a moment, she slowly began to walk toward the edge, moving carefully against the current. When she reached the bank, Thomas offered his arm to help her climb out. She accepted, though her hands trembled slightly. As soon as she stepped onto the dry ground, she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to keep warm. Thomas quickly took off his coat and placed it around her shoulders. She looked up at him with gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she murmured. Thomas gave her an encouraging smile. "You're safe now. Let's get you warmed up." He guided her toward a patch of flat ground near a fallen log where she could sit. The woman lowered herself onto the log, still shivering a little. Thomas crouched beside her and waited patiently until she seemed ready to speak. "What happened?" he asked gently. She took a slow breath, trying to steady her voice. "I was traveling," she began, glancing back at the river for a moment. "I stopped to rest here. I thought it was a safe spot. Then those men came." Her voice trailed off, and she looked down at her hands. They were wet, cold, and shaking slightly. Thomas didn't rush her. He simply waited. After a few seconds, she continued. "They told me they were traders. They spoke kindly at first, so I didn't expect anything bad. I thought they wanted to ask for directions or share news from the next town. But then," she paused again, searching for the right words. "They tricked me. They took everything I had. My horse, my pack, everything." Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. Even though she didn't describe anything harmful, he could hear the fear and frustration in her voice. He stayed calm and let her continue. When I tried to follow them, I slipped and fell into the river, she said, lowering her head. By the time I got up, they were already riding away. Thomas looked at her with concern. I'm sorry that happened to you. I truly am. The woman nodded, her eyes glistening not with tears, but with determination. She wasn't someone who gave up easily. Thomas could already tell. Do you know which way they went? He asked. Yes, she answered, lifting her hand to point toward the ridge in the distance. They went that way. Thomas followed her gesture again. The dust trail was gone by now, but he could still imagine the riders disappearing into the hills. I'll help you, Thomas said firmly. We'll get your things back. The woman's eyes widened slightly in surprise. You would do that? Of course, Thomas replied. No one deserves to be treated unfairly out here. And you shouldn't have to face this alone. She pressed her lips together, visibly moved by his kindness. Thank you, she whispered. My name is Nalan. Nice to meet you, Nalan. I'm Thomas. The morning sun had now risen higher, warming the ground and drying the edges of her clothes. Thomas helped her stand up and guided her toward his ranch house, which wasn't far from the river. As they walked, Nalan watched the land around her with curiosity. She seemed alert, like someone who had traveled many places and learned to pay attention to the world. When they reached the ranch house, Thomas opened the door for her. Inside, the air felt warm and comforting. He brought a blanket for her to wrap around herself and set a cup of warm tea in front of her. Nalan accepted everything with quiet gratitude. She sat by the small window, letting the light fall over her face. Thomas stood nearby, giving her space while also keeping an eye on her in case she needed anything. After a short silence, Nalan spoke again. I didn't expect someone to help me. I thought I would be alone until I reached the next settlement. Well, Thomas said with a small smile. Luck brought you near my ranch, and I'm glad it did. Nalan returned the smile, though it was faint and tired. I just want what I lost. Those things were important to me, and we'll get them back, Thomas assured her. You have my word. As the morning grew brighter, Thomas stepped outside to check his horse and prepare supplies. He knew the day would not be as quiet as he had planned, but he didn't mind. Something inside him felt certain that helping Nalan was the right thing to do. And though neither of them knew it yet, this unexpected meeting by the river was only the beginning of a journey that would test their courage, challenge their beliefs, and form a bond built on trust. The peaceful morning had turned into something else, something meaningful, something that would change the day completely. What started as a simple cry for help from the water had pulled Thomas into a story he never expected to be part of. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the riders who took Nalan's things had no idea that their easy escape was already over. Nalan sat quietly near the warm stove inside Thomas's ranch house, holding the cup of tea between her hands. The warmth slowly spread through her fingers and into her chest, calming the shivers that still lingered from the cold river. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, turning the sky bright and clear. The peaceful light inside the small house made everything feel safe for the first time since morning. Thomas sat across from her at the small wooden table. He didn't rush her or ask questions too quickly. He simply waited, giving her time to settle and breathe. He could tell Nalan had been through a difficult experience, but he also sensed strength in her, something steady and brave behind her tired eyes. After a few minutes, Nalan placed the cup on the table and folded her hands in her lap. She took a slow breath and began speaking on her own, without Thomas needing to ask. I was traveling to visit my sister, she said softly. Her family lives near the mountains, several days from here. I left my village early in the week so I could reach her before the colder nights began. Thomas nodded, listening carefully. I plan to follow the main trail, she continued. But I like to stop by rivers when I can. The sound of water helps me think, and it makes the journey feel lighter. Thomas smiled gently. That makes sense. It's a peaceful place to rest. Nalan gave a small nod. Yes, it was peaceful, at first. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Her eyes shifted to the window, where she could see part of the calm, grassy land outside. I reached the river early in the morning, she said. I let my horse drink, and started preparing a simple breakfast. Everything felt quiet and safe, so I didn't expect anyone to come. She touched the edge of the blanket Thomas had given her, as if grounding herself before continuing. While I was preparing my things, she said, I heard footsteps approaching. I turned around and saw 3 men walking toward me. They carried small bags and wore hats that covered most of their faces. They smiled in a friendly way, so I thought they were travelers too. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Did they speak to you first? Yes, she replied. They greeted me and said they were traders going to the next settlement. They asked if they could rest by the water for a moment. I agreed. I didn't see any reason not to. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, remembering the moment clearly. They told me they had been walking for hours and were tired. They asked where I was heading. I told them I was visiting family. They seemed kind at first. One of them even said he knew the trail near the mountains and that it was safe this time of season. Her voice grew softer as she recalled the shift in their behavior. But then, she said, they started asking about my belongings. They asked what I carried in my pack and whether I had supplies. At first, I thought they were just curious, but their questions became too many. I felt uncomfortable. Thomas frowned slightly, sensing where her story was going. I told them I needed to continue my journey, she said. I packed my things and started getting ready to leave. That's when one of them stepped closer to my horse. He touched the saddle and said he wanted to look at it. I told him not to, but he ignored me. Her hands tightened slightly around the blanket. The other 2 men moved to my bags, she continued. They opened my pack without asking. I told them to stop, but they didn't listen. They spoke over me, saying they were only checking. But I knew they weren't. Thomas kept his expression calm, careful not to make her feel more upset. I tried to get closer to them, Nolan said, but one of the men stepped in front of me. He didn't say anything harsh, but he blocked my way. I felt trapped. I didn't want to argue or cause trouble, so I stepped back and tried to think. Nolan took a breath, steady but emotional. Then, she said quietly, they took everything. My horse, my food, and my personal items. They didn't push me or hurt me, but they took what didn't belong to them. They acted as if it was nothing at all, as if they had the right. Thomas felt a wave of frustration, but he stayed composed for her sake. You didn't deserve that, he said gently. Nolan nodded. Her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. I tried to follow them when they began walking toward their horses, but I lost my balance. The ground near the river was slippery. Before I knew it, I fell into the water. By the time I stood up again, they were already mounting the horses, my horse, and riding away. She looked down at the table. I called out to them, but they didn't look back. Thomas leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. He didn't speak right away. He wanted to choose the right words. Words that would bring comfort rather than worry. But you didn't give up, he said finally. You looked for help. Nolan looked up at him, her eyes steady and clear. I had to, she said. Those things meant something to me. Not just because they're useful, but because they were gifts from my family. I couldn't let them disappear. Thomas admired her determination. She wasn't someone who simply stepped aside when something unfair happened. She fought in her own way, calmly, bravely, and without giving in to fear. You made the right choice coming toward the sound of the ranch, Thomas said. Even if it wasn't planned. Nolan gave him a gentle smile. I didn't even know someone lived this close. I was lucky to be heard. Not luck, Thomas replied. Just good timing. The warmth in the room grew stronger as the stove continued to burn softly. The sunlight from the window settled over the wooden floor and over Nolan's shoulders, making her look more comfortable than before. You said you know which way they went, Thomas reminded her softly. Nolan nodded. I do. I watched them ride up the ridge. I saw the direction they took. Thomas placed his hat on the table. Then we'll follow that trail together. Nolan blinked in surprise. You would go with me? Of course, Thomas said simply. It's the right thing to do. And 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. For a moment, Nolan said nothing. She simply studied his face, as if trying to understand why a stranger would help her so much. But she soon realized Thomas was genuine. He wasn't helping for reward or recognition. He was helping because he cared. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of sincerity. "I'm grateful," Thomas nodded. "Rest for a little while. When you feel ready, we'll start the trail." Nalin folded the blanket around herself more tightly and leaned back against the chair. For the first time since the river, she felt a sense of direction again, a path that wouldn't leave her helpless, but would lead her toward justice and peace. While she rested, Thomas stepped outside to prepare the horses and gather supplies for the journey. The land stretched wide and quiet around him, but he carried a new sense of purpose. He didn't know Nalin's full story yet, but he knew enough to understand that she deserved help, and he intended to give it. This journey, which began with a voice calling from the water, was only just beginning. Thomas walked back into the house after preparing the horses, brushing the dust off his sleeves. Nalin looked up from the chair where she had been resting. She seemed calmer now, more collected. Her clothes had begun to dry, and the color had returned to her face. She stood up as he entered, ready for whatever came next. "Are you prepared?" Thomas asked kindly. Nalin gave a small nod. "Yes, I'm ready." Thomas handed her a small piece of bread and some dried fruit, knowing she probably hadn't eaten since dawn. She accepted the food with soft gratitude and ate slowly as they walked out to the stable. 2 horses stood waiting, Thomas's strong bay gelding and a chestnut mare he used for guests or extra travel. "You can ride the mare," Thomas said. "She's gentle and listens well." Nalin reached out and touched the horse's neck. The mare lowered her head as if she sensed Nalin's soft nature. It brought a small, relieved smile to Nalin's lips. "She's beautiful," she said quietly. "She'll take good care of you," Thomas replied. They mounted up and started toward the trail where Nalin had last seen the 3 men. The land stretched wide and bright under the rising sun. The ground was dry, with patches of green grass scattered between rocks and sandy soil. In the distance, gentle hills rolled across the horizon, leading toward the ridge Nalin had pointed out earlier. For the first part of the ride, neither of them spoke much. Thomas focused on the tracks ahead, while Nalin scanned the land with sharp eyes. As they rode, the cool morning slowly warmed into a dry midday, but the air remained pleasant, with a soft breeze passing over them. After a while, Nalin broke the silence. "Thank you again for helping me," she said softly. "I know it is not a small thing to leave your work behind." Thomas glanced at her and smiled. "Sometimes life gives us something more important than our usual chores. Helping someone, that's worth more than anything on the ranch." Nalin looked ahead thoughtfully. "Where I come from, helping others is also important. It is something we teach from childhood, but I did not expect someone far from my home to do the same." "I think kindness doesn't belong to one place," Thomas replied. "It can grow anywhere." Nalin nodded slowly, appreciating his words. They traveled for nearly an hour before Thomas stopped his horse and examined the ground. Faint hoofprints curved across the dirt, heading toward the ridge. The tracks were not deep, which meant the riders hadn't been moving too fast. "Do these look right?" Thomas asked, pointing down. Nalin dismounted without hesitation. She crouched beside the tracks and studied them closely. Her eyes moved carefully, noticing details Thomas might have missed. "These belong to 3 horses," she said. "And one of them is my horse. I know the shape of his prints." Thomas admired her certainty. "You're good at this." "I've traveled many paths," she replied. "You learn to pay attention when the world is wide and full of different footsteps." She stood back up and brushed the dust from her hands. "They are still ahead. Not too far." They continued riding, now with more confidence. The trail led them across a dry plain dotted with low shrubs. Birds flew overhead, casting small moving shadows on the ground. Occasionally, Nalin would lower her gaze to confirm the direction, and Thomas trusted her judgment without question. As they followed the tracks, the land gradually changed. The open plain gave way to gentle slopes and rocky ground. Large stones and scattered boulders lined the path, making the ride a little rougher. The horses stepped carefully among them. "People sometimes hide in places like this," Thomas said, looking around. "These rocks make it hard to see ahead." Nalin nodded. "Yes. They may stop here to rest or look around." After climbing a narrow path between two tall rocks, they entered a small valley hidden between hills. In the middle of the valley, they found signs of a recently used camp, ashes from a small fire, footprints, and marks where horses had been tied. Thomas dismounted and examined the ashes. "Not cold," he said. "They were here maybe an hour ago." Nalin walked slowly around the camp. She picked up a broken twig, examined a patch of crushed grass, and looked at the direction of the trails from the camp. "They didn't stay long," she said. "They probably left when they saw dust from your ranch. They must have known someone might follow." Thomas raised his brows. "They're moving quickly then." "Yes," Nalin said. "But not too quickly. My horse is strong, but they don't know how to guide him well. They won't push him hard." "Good," Thomas said. "That gives us an advantage." They mounted again and followed the freshest trail out of the valley. The path now led upward, toward a rocky ridge with scattered pines. The climb was slow but steady. The air grew cooler as they gained height, and the breeze carried the scent of pine needles. As they rode, Thomas glanced at Nalin. "You seem comfortable traveling through places like this." "I've walked through forests, plains, and mountains," she said. "My family taught me to understand the land. It speaks in small ways." Thomas chuckled softly. "I wish the land spoke to me like that." "It does," Nalin said gently. "You just have to listen differently." Thomas appreciated her calm wisdom. She wasn't loud or forceful, but her knowledge felt deep and steady, like a flowing river. When they reached the top of the ridge, they both paused to look down into the valley below. The view stretched far, revealing miles of wild land that glowed under the sun. A thin trail of hoofprints continued toward a cluster of old wooden structures near a dried creek bed. Thomas narrowed his eyes. "That looks like an abandoned mining place." Nalin followed his gaze. "Do people live there?" "Not usually," Thomas said. "But sometimes travelers stop there for shade. And sometimes, people stop there for other reasons." Nalin didn't need him to explain further. The old structures made sense as a hiding place, quiet, forgotten, and far from the main trail. "They might be there," she said. "They may think no one will follow." Thomas guided his horse forward again, this time with more caution. The descent wasn't steep, but they moved slowly, making as little noise as possible. As they approached the abandoned buildings, Thomas signaled Nalin to stop. "Let's stay quiet from here," he said. "We don't know what they're doing." Nalin nodded and lowered her voice. "I understand." They tied their horses behind a group of bushes and continued on foot. The air felt still, as if waiting for something. The old wooden structures stood silent, their roofs weathered, and their walls faded by years of sun and wind. Thomas glanced at Nalin. "Stay close," she did, moving softly beside him. As they neared the first building, Thomas listened carefully. A faint murmur reached his ears' voices. He couldn't make out words, but he knew they belonged to the men they were looking for. Nalin pointed with a small gesture. "There," she whispered, "inside the larger shed." Thomas nodded. They moved closer, staying behind an old fence post. Now Thomas could hear them more clearly. The men were talking, laughing even, as if they had no worries in the world. Nalin's eyes narrowed with calm determination, not anger, only focus. "They have my things," she said softly. Thomas sensed the same thing. He also felt something stronger, a responsibility to stand with her. "We'll handle this," he whispered. "But we must stay smart." Together, they crouched behind the last barrier before the open ground near the shed. The moment felt heavy with anticipation, but also hopeful. They had followed the trail with patience and courage. They had found the place where the riders had stopped. Now, what happened next would decide everything. The long journey across the plains and hills had brought them to the moment of truth, and they were ready for it. Thomas and Nalin stayed hidden behind the old fence post for a few moments, letting the quiet air settle around them. The abandoned mining place felt still, almost like it was holding its breath. In the distance, a thin cloud drifted across the sky, casting a soft shadow over the wooden structures. The world around them was peaceful, but the situation felt delicate. They needed to be careful, thoughtful, and prepared for whatever happened next. Thomas leaned slightly toward Nalin and whispered, "We should watch first. Understand what they are doing." Nalin nodded gently. She wasn't nervous, her face was steady, calm, and focused. Her patience showed her experience with traveling and facing unexpected moments. She knew that rushing in without understanding could make things harder, not easier. Slowly, Thomas peeked over the fence. In the open area near the large shed, he saw the three men who had taken Nalin's belongings. They were sitting on old crates and talking among themselves. One of them was holding Nalin's pack. Another had her saddle beside him. Her horse stood tied to a post nearby, looking peaceful but tired. Nalin looked over carefully too. Her eyes softened when she saw her horse. "He must be confused," she whispered. "He doesn't know them." Thomas nodded. "We'll bring him back to you soon." None of the men looked troubled or in a hurry. They appeared relaxed, almost like they believed the world was completely on their side. Thomas studied their body language. They weren't angry, they weren't alert. They seemed certain that no one would come looking for them. That would be their mistake. Thomas slowly stepped back from the fence and thought for a moment. His mind was steady, thinking of a way to approach them peacefully. He didn't want fear. He didn't want conflict. He didn't want raised voices or harsh actions. He wanted fairness, calmness, and honesty. Nalin waited quietly, respecting his space as he planned. Finally, Thomas looked at her. "Listen," he said gently. "We'll walk toward them calmly. No sudden movements. Nothing loud. We just talk." Nalin nodded. "I trust your judgment." Thomas smiled softly. He admired her courage. Even after the difficult morning she had faced, she carried herself with dignity and strength. They stepped out from behind the fence, walking side by side across the open space. Their footsteps made light sounds on the dry ground. The breeze moved through the scattered grass, and a bird called from the trees above. At first, the men didn't notice them. But as Thomas and Nalin approached closer, one of the men lifted his head. His eyes widened in surprise when he recognized them, especially Nalin. "Well now," the man said, standing up slowly. "Didn't expect visitors." The second man looked over his shoulder, stopping mid-sentence when he saw who it was. The third man, the one near the horse, paused as well. Thomas spoke before any of them could say something else. "Good afternoon," he said calmly. His voice was steady and polite, not accusing. "We came to talk." The men exchanged glances. Their faces didn't show anger, more confusion than anything. They hadn't expected someone to follow them this far, and certainly not someone who carried himself with calm confidence. Nalin stood slightly behind Thomas but close enough to be seen clearly. She looked at the men with quiet strength, not harsh, not fearful, just firm. Her presence alone reminded them of the choice they had made earlier that morning. Thomas continued speaking. "This woman is missing her belongings," he said. "We believe you have them." One of the men opened his mouth as if to argue, but Thomas gently raised a hand, not in a demanding way, but in a peaceful gesture. "Let's talk kindly," he said. "We all know what's fair." The men looked at each other again. They weren't sure how to react. They expected anger or shouting, but instead Thomas brought calmness and clarity. It changed the atmosphere. The man holding Nalin's pack scratched his head. "Well, we were just borrowing a few things." Nalin stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "Those things were not given to you. They mean a lot to me. They are from my family." Her tone wasn't sharp. It carried emotion but not blame. She spoke with honesty and sincerity, something that touched the men more than any harsh words could. The man with the pack lowered it slowly. "We didn't mean any real harm," he said, not making eye contact. "We just thought you wouldn't mind too much," Thomas replied gently. "She does." and she deserves to have her belongings back. The second man pointed toward the mare Thomas and Nalin arrived with. You two followed us all the way from the river? Yes, Thomas said. Because helping someone who needs it is important. The men shifted uncomfortably. Their earlier confidence faded as they realized the situation wasn't simply about things, it was about doing the right thing. After a short silence, the man closest to the stolen horse sighed. Well, the things are right there, he said, pointing at the pack and saddle. You can take them. Round. You can take them. Nalin stepped forward and gently picked up her pack. She held it close to her chest for a moment, her eyes soft with relief. She touched the saddle as if greeting an old friend. Thomas thanked the men with a nod. We appreciate your cooperation, he said. It's better for everyone when things are handled with respect. The men didn't argue. Their expressions softened, as though a weight had been lifted simply by being treated fairly instead of harshly. Nalin walked toward her horse slowly. When the animal saw her, it lifted its head and let out a small, warm sound. Nalin reached out and stroked its neck, whispering softly. The horse nuzzled her gently, as if saying it was glad she had come back. Thomas watched the moment with a quiet smile. It felt like the world around them settled into a peaceful rhythm again. Once Nalin secured her belongings, Thomas looked back at the three men. I hope the rest of your journey is better, he said simply. Take care of yourselves. The men nodded, almost humbled by the kindness offered instead of anger. Thomas and Nalin guided her horse away from the mining area. As they stepped back onto the open trail, the breeze carried the warm scent of sunlit earth. The land felt wide and kind again. After a few minutes of walking, Nalin spoke, her voice gentle. The way you handled that, it was admirable. Thomas shrugged softly. Sometimes talking calmly opens doors that force cannot. They listened because you gave them respect, Nalin said. Even when they showed none earlier. Thomas looked ahead at the open land. Everyone has a moment when they can choose to do better. I hoped they would choose it today. And they did, Nalin said, smiling. They mounted their horses again. The gentle sounds of hooves on dirt filling the quiet afternoon. The tension of the day slowly faded, replaced by gratitude, relief, and a newfound trust between them. The journey back felt lighter. The land seemed brighter, and the trail ahead held a feeling of hope because the hardest part of their journey had ended, not with conflict, but with understanding. And somewhere behind them, the three men sat in silence, perhaps thinking about how a calm conversation had changed the day for everyone. The next morning arrived slowly, with a soft golden glow spreading across the ranch land. Samuel stepped outside before sunrise, letting the cool air touch his face. It was peaceful, so peaceful that anyone passing by could never guess the emotional storms that had just calmed the day before. He looked out toward the river where he had first heard the Apache woman shout for help. That moment felt distant now, yet it had changed everything for both of them. Nadina walked out of the small guest cabin a few minutes later. She looked more rested than she had in days. Her hair was braided neatly, and she carried herself with the same calm dignity she always showed. When she noticed Samuel watching the horizon, she walked toward him with a soft smile. He returned the smile with genuine warmth. They didn't speak for a few minutes. They just observed the rising sun, each lost in their own thoughts. Samuel was thinking about how trust was built slowly, carefully, often after misunderstandings or small conflicts. Nadina, on the other hand, was thinking about how unusual it was to meet a man who listened first, instead of assuming everything. In her heart, she felt grateful for the chance to clear her name and recover her belongings, but she also felt something deeper: peace, the kind that comes when someone finally believes your truth. When the light grew brighter, Nadina finally broke the silence. She said she wanted to visit the place where her things had been found. Not to confront anyone, but to see for herself. Samuel agreed right away. He saddled the horses and made sure their journey would be safe and calm. As they rode out toward the river trail, Nadina looked around at the vast land stretching out in every direction. She admired it, the quiet fields, the soft movement of grass in the breeze, and the way sunlight touched the earth gently. She had passed by this area before, but she had never looked at it the way she did now. The worry she once carried was gone, replaced by relief and curiosity about what would come next. They reached the spot where her belongings had been returned. Nadina climbed down from her horse and walked slowly around the place, touching the ground as if trying to understand the events that had happened there. She sighed softly, not in sadness but in acceptance. She had regained her things and cleared her name. The past could stay where it belonged. Samuel watched her quietly. There was no need to speak. He could tell she was processing everything in her own thoughtful way. When she finally stood up and turned toward him, she looked content. She said she wanted to express her thanks not just for helping her recover her belongings, but for treating her with fairness. Many times in her life, people had judged her without listening, simply because she was Apache. But Samuel had been different from the start. She wanted him to know that his kindness had made a deep impact. Samuel shook his head humbly. He explained that doing what was right was not something he saw as special. It was simply what any decent person should do. But Nadina insisted that his actions meant more than he realized. People often spoke about fairness, but very few practiced it when it mattered. Samuel's actions had given her hope that cooperation and understanding between people of different worlds were still possible. They talked for a long time under the shade of a tree nearby. Nadina shared stories about her life, her village, her family, her beliefs, and the values she was raised with. Samuel listened closely, asking thoughtful questions and wanting to understand things more deeply. In return, he shared stories of his ranch, his late parents, and how he came to take care of the land on his own. What surprised Nadina most was how gentle Samuel's stories were. Even when he talked about hardships, he didn't focus on bitterness. He focused on what he learned from them. She felt comfortable speaking freely around him, something she didn't feel often with strangers. Eventually, Nadina mentioned she would soon need to return to her people. She had responsibilities waiting for her, and they would surely be worried about her absence. Samuel nodded, understanding completely, but still, he felt a quiet heaviness in his chest. He had enjoyed her company more than he expected. He didn't want to hold her back, but he also didn't want their paths to end here. Nadina noticed his expression and smiled gently. She told him that goodbye did not need to mean the end of a connection. People who respected each other could always meet again, even if they lived very different lives. Samuel smiled back at her, relieved by her words. Together, they rode back to the ranch. Nadina packed her belongings with care. Samuel prepared some food and supplies for her journey, wanting to make her trip home safe and comfortable. When everything was ready, they stood facing each other near the edge of the ranch land. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply looked at each other with mutual understanding. Nadina thanked him once again, not with long speeches but with sincerity in her voice. Samuel told her she would always be welcome on his land, whether she needed help or simply wished to visit. Nadina climbed onto her horse and adjusted her satchel. She glanced at the river one last time, the place where everything had begun. Then she looked at Samuel and gave him a respectful nod. He nodded back firmly, promising silently that he would always remember this experience. She started to ride away slowly. Samuel watched her until she became a small figure in the distance, moving gracefully through the open land. As she disappeared around a curve in the trail, he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sad, but thoughtful the way a person feels after gaining something valuable without expecting it. He turned back toward his ranch and walked slowly, appreciating the land with fresh eyes. Helping Nadina had reminded him of something important: that understanding and kindness could bridge even the widest distances between people. And sometimes, a single unexpected event, like a woman shouting from the water, could lead to a connection that changed one's perspective forever. Days later, Samuel found himself looking toward the horizon often, wondering how Nadina was doing and whether she had reached her village safely. He didn't know when or if their paths would cross again, but he believed they would, in time. Some connections were too sincere to fade, and though life on the ranch returned to its steady routine, Samuel carried the memory of their meeting like a warm light inside him. It reminded him to stay open, to listen, to trust, and to look beyond first impressions. Nadina's story had become part of his own story now, a chapter he would always look back on, with respect and gratitude. Their worlds were different, but their hearts had shared a brief, honest moment of understanding. And sometimes, that was all it took to change two lives in quiet but meaningful ways.